Asterisk the wind cut low across the basin, whispering over scorched dirt and fence posts rotting in place. Dust slid along the bones of a forgotten corral. A vulture circled high, and beneath it a man sat motionless in the shadow of a broken porch eyes. Fixed west, where the sun bled across the rim of the earth. Asterisk he didn't blink. Didn't shift. Just stared. Asterisk Cullen Rourke hadn't spoken in 1,128 days. Not since the fire that took his boy and left only ash in the cradle and splinters where a woman used to hum. He counted days by the notch of sun against his barn's war-torn flank and by the absence of sound inside his lungs. He didn't drink anymore. Didn't dream. The cattle had wandered off last fall and he hadn't followed. Asterisk, but today he watched the horizon like it owed him something. Asterisk the ground trembled. Not loud, just barely. Asterisk he stood slowly. Knee stiff. One boot caked in cracked leather, the other split at the toe. His rifle leaned inside the doorway. He took it without looking. Wind blew through the empty ranch house behind him, rattling pans that hadn't seen fire in years. A child's shoe, nailed to the beam above, swung slightly. Then he saw them, 11. Riders barely holding together. Their horses staggered like they'd crossed the whole desert without rest. The women sat rigid sunburned faces, stained coats, a few with canteens bouncing half-empty at their hips. But their eyes were the kind that had stared too long into gun barrels and backfires. One of them rode with her arm in a sling. Another led a second horse carrying a limp shape wrapped in canvas. They didn't speak as they approached. Cullen didn't either. Asterisk the lead rider dismounted. Tall, lean, her dark uniform torn across one sleeve and patched crudely with canvas. A long scar climbed her jaw to her temple, and her eyes were cold but clear. She stopped 5 paces from him and let the silence hang. Asterisk wind whistled between them. Asterisk her voice, when it came, was raw and level. We need rest and cover, 2 days. That's all. Asterisk Cullen didn't move. Didn't blink. He studied her the way he might study a Wolf sniffing the barn door, half afraid. Half too tired to care. Asterisk I'll trade labor, she added, reading him. We don't want charity, just air. And distance. Asterisk, he glanced behind her. 11 in total, 1 bleeding. 1 unconscious. All military, even without the stripes. He should have said no, instead. He stepped aside. Asterisk she nodded once, just once, and waved them forward. The horses moved reluctantly. One woman slid from her saddle and fell to a knee. Another, older, guided her forward. The limp body was lowered onto hay that hadn't been turned in months. The water trough hissed as canteens were dunked. No one raised their voice? No one asked his name? Asterisk by nightfall, the moon had risen, blood orange and swollen. Cullen stood in the doorway, watching shadows flicker against the barn wall as someone lit a small, controlled flame. They were smart. Disciplined, no idle chatter, they rotated watch positions. Cleaned what they touched. Fed their wounded first. Asterisk he hadn't seen women like this since Missouri. Not even during the war. These were different. Survivors. The scarred one, she had a name, though he hadn't asked who came to the porch again. She leaned against the rail, arms folded, as if she were weighing him like a supply cache. Asterisk, my name's Maeve, she said. Sergeant. 18th Volunteer Battalion. Disbanded last winter. Still, Cullen said nothing. She let silence sit again. Asterisk. We're not deserters. We're not fugitives. Asterisk he glanced sideways. One brow raised slightly. Asterisk Maeve tilted her head. We're ghosts, Mr. Asterisk. He turned away. Walked inside. He didn't sleep. Asterisk storms flickered beyond the mesa line. A red sky before midnight. Thunder without sound. Cullen lit a lamp once, only to stare at a photograph he kept hidden beneath the loose floorboard under his bed. A child, no older than 4, laughing in a wooden washtub. A woman's hand resting on his shoulder. Her face gone to ash. Asterisk by morning. Dust coated the window panes. Asterisk the barn door creaked open. Cullen watched from a distance as the women moved with quiet efficiency. 2 repaired the stable gate. Another dug a latrine trench. One tall woman with tightly braided hair took it upon herself to clean the rusted troughs, muttering hymns under her breath. Maeve approached him again near the fencelin, carrying a bag of rusted nails and a silent resolve. You had children? She asked softly. It was a long moment before Cullen looked at her. His jaw tightened. We heard rumors, she continued, about a man who never left his ranch, who never raised his voice, never drew a gun, and once dragged a dying man 3 miles through snow just to leave him near a preacher's door. Cullen's fingers gripped the fence post tighter. She dropped the nail pouch beside his boot. We don't have a preacher, but we could use someone who doesn't flinch at dying. Then she turned without waiting for a reply. That night, a different wind came. Not the gentle sigh of summer or the roar of July thunder. This was a whispering wind, low, urgent, like footsteps on bone-dry gravel. Cullen stood again on his porch, rifle across his chest. The moon had vanished behind high clouds. Somewhere on the ridgeline, something moved. Not animal, not storm. He heard it in the distance, a whistle, sharp, military, the kind only certain men used. The kind meant to signal, go quiet, not charge. He stepped off the porch and crossed to the barn. Maeve was already there, holding a lantern low. Clara, the mute woman, stood by the rear doors, knife in hand. Maeve spoke, barely. Above breath, they found us. Cullen glanced toward the hills, then back at her, no surprise in his face. Only inevitability. How many rifles do you have? She asked. Cullen stepped past her into the barn, opened a crate, removed a dust-covered tarp, beneath it. 3 rifles. 2 shotguns. A bayonet from a forgotten war. Maeve blinked once as if she hadn't expected an answer at all. Cullen handed her the shotgun. Then, finally, he spoke. 1 night. That's all you get. The ridge was dark by dawn, swallowed by a storm that had come without warning. The land was still, but the air was restless, alive, with the kind of tension only an approaching fight can stir. Inside the barn, Maeve reloaded her shotgun with quiet, deliberate movements, each shell slipping into place like a whispered promise. Cullen stood in the shadows, watching the sky turn from dark blue to bruised gray. His fingers brushed the handle of his rifle, then his boots, worn through and calloused from too many miles. He hadn't felt this awake in years, alive in a way that didn't hurt but gnawed at the edges of his bones. From behind him, a whisper of fabric. He turned to see Etta, her dark hair twisted tightly in braids. She moved with the grace of someone who knew the weight of the world, yet carried it without complaint. She had the look of someone who had been both broken and reforged. Dan, old soul in a young body. We need to move the horses, Etta said, her voice soft, but laced with an undeniable urgency. They'll spook if we don't. Cullen nodded, wordlessly following her out into the cold, dry air. The horses were tethered to the low fence, their breaths visible in the early morning chill. They were skittish, their ears twitching at every sound, every scrape of wind. Etta handed him a length of rope, and together they led the animals into the barn. She didn't speak again until they were back inside. Do you know who's coming? She asked, her eyes scanning his face for some hint of recognition, some piece of his past that might make sense of the storm that was about to break. Cullen's gaze turned to the horizon, where dust began to rise in jagged columns. He didn't need to answer her question. The truth was already in the air. It had been in the air since the moment he let them onto his ranch. The bounty hunters were here. By midday, the storm had shifted. It was no longer just weather. It had become something darker, something more deliberate. The women moved like soldiers, silent, efficient, no wasted energy. Maeve and Clara stood at the ridge, watching through binoculars. Ada and Joe worked together, moving swiftly in the barn, preparing the horses, preparing for a fight. Cullen had no illusions about what was coming. The bounty hunters had tracked them for days. They had seen the smoke from the fire. The women had no choice but to run. But Cullen, he had a choice. And as much as he wanted to pretend that the years of isolation had softened him, he knew that part of him still remembered how to fight. But he was not the man he once was. He watched as the women moved, as they positioned themselves around the ranch, silently preparing for something they all knew was inevitable. The silence between them was deafening, no words were needed. They knew their roles, they knew what would come. And still, they held on to something, their own quiet hope perhaps, or simply the stubborn will to survive. It wasn't long before the first sound of hooves reached their ears. The men came in waves, the first group riding hard across the basin, 3 of them armed with rifles and pistols. The others hung back, circling wide, as if they knew they had all the time in the world. Maeve's eyes narrowed as she watched them approach. Her hand tightened on the barrel of her shotgun. She glanced at Cullen, who stood at the corner of the barn, waiting. He didn't speak, but the look he gave her was enough. They were here. And they weren't leaving without blood. The first group stopped just short of the fence line, their horses kicking up dust in the dry heat. They sat tall in their saddles, eyes sharp and calculating. You're on our land. One of the men called out, his voice a grating rasp. Get out now, and we'll forget we ever saw you. Maeve's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. The tension in the air thickened like a storm cloud, hanging between them all. There were no threats, no idle words, just the promise of violence. In the silence, another rider came into view behind them, his horse kicking up a plume of dust as he approached at a steady, slow pace. He didn't look like the others. Where the first group had been ragged, rough-hewn men, this rider was clean-cut, his uniform neat, his posture rigid. He wore a faded black hat, and his eyes never left Cullen. I'm not here to make trouble. The man said, his voice carrying across the distance. I'm just here for what's mine. Cullen's eyes narrowed. He didn't need to ask what the man meant. He knew. You're too late, Cullen said, his voice low but carrying. The man's gaze flicked to Maeve, then back to Cullen. His lips twisted into something that was almost a smile. We'll see, he said, and with that he kicked his horse forward. What followed wasn't a fight in the usual sense. The women had been prepared, but not for this. Not for the speed and precision with which the bounty hunters struck. Gunshots rang out in quick bursts, echoing off the distant hills. Maeve ducked, pulling Cullen down with her as a bullet whizzed past, inches from his face. A second shot hit the barn wall with a deafening crack, sending splinters flying. The horses screamed in panic. Cullen scrambled to his feet, rifle raised. His body ached from the motion, his knee, his back, but he ignored it. The barn had become a battlefield. The women fired from their positions, aiming for the men on horseback. The sound of gunfire was constant now, sharp and unrelenting. The dust hung thick in the air, mixing with the sharp tang of gunpowder. Maeve fired again, her shot ringing out with deadly accuracy. One of the riders dropped from his horse, rolling to the ground in a cloud of dust. The others scattered, circling the ranch, trying to find an opening. Cullen ran for cover behind the barn, heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The women had made their stand. Now it was up to them to finish. The battle lasted longer than Cullen expected, longer than he thought his body would allow. His hands were raw from the rifle stock, his lungs burned. But still, he fought, moved from cover to cover. The sound of his own breath loud in his ears. By the time the smoke cleared, the ground was littered with spent cartridges, the bodies of 2 bounty hunters, and the twisted remains of the horses. The women stood victorious but battered, their eyes haunted, their bodies bloodied. But unbowed. Cullen's heart raced as he met Maeve's gaze across the battlefield. She didn't smile, didn't offer a word of praise. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression unreadable. Your ranch is safe, she said. Her voice steady. But Cullen knew better than anyone that safety was never permanent. Not in a world like this. The sun began to set, the storm clouds lingering in the distance, but the silence that followed was louder than any battle cry. It was the kind of silence that comes after the storm when the dust has settled, and All that's left are the memories of what came before. Asterisk in the end, they had survived. But at what cost? Cullen didn't know. What he did know was that there was no going back. The past had caught up with them all, and no amount of gunfire could change what had been done. Asterisk, the women were still here. But for how long? Cullen stood at the edge of the pasture as dawn crawled in slow and red over the hills. The world was hushed, not with peace but with a breath held tight. Smoke curled faintly from the burned barn door where blood still stained the dirt. Asha clung to his sleeves. Behind him, 11 women stirred quietly in the bunkhouse, some tending wounds, others fixing gear, but no one spoke of leaving. Asterisk, the storm hadn't broken. It had only stepped back. They all knew this wasn't over. He'd seen the man Major Harlan Sykes at a distance yesterday. Not one of the bounty dogs they'd downed. No, Sykes hadn't fired a shot yet. He was still circling like a wolf watching a wounded herd. Asterisk, Cullen's breath fogged in the morning air. His knee throbbed. His hands ached from recoil and hammering. Broken boards across shattered windows. But the worst pain lived elsewhere, deep in the chest, behind the ribs, where his boy's voice used to echo in dreams. Asterisk, Maeve stood beside him now. No sound, just presence. One eye bandaged from a splintered ricochet, the other watching the hills like she could see through time. Asterisk, I saw him once, she said finally, voice dry from smoke and pain. Back in Baton Rouge, burned 3 homes because a woman refused to give him her sons, called it compliance. Asterisk, Cullen didn't answer. He didn't need to. Asterisk, the name Sykes was carved into the walls of too many broken homes. He remembered it too. From dispatches, from whispered stories, from the sealed letter never sent, clenched in his dead wife's fist the day the fire took everything. Asterisk, I think he's waiting for sundown, Maeve murmured. He wants us to be tired. Cullen nodded, then turned and walked away. Eta stitched her own shoulder in the bunkhouse. Clara helped. No words, just nods. Blood seeped into the bandage like ink into snow. Joe the youngest sat on the floor, sharpening a blade with hands that shook but didn't stop. She didn't cry. Not since the ambush. Not since she saw the bodies. They had become something else. Not a unit. Not a family. But something ancient, like stone worn by weather and fire. Asterisk, Maeve watched them all quietly from the doorframe. When Cullen returned, he carried 2 things, a rusted U.S. cavalry saber and a charred tin locket. The saber was his father's, the locket was his son's. Asterisk, I'm not leaving, he said. No one asked him to. Asterisk, by afternoon, the wind had shifted. The air turned warm, still, ominous. Asterisk, from the far ridge came the sound of hooves, deliberate, calm. Asterisk, Sykes rode in with 5 men behind him. No banners, no shouts, just quiet menace. The kind that came from confidence or cruelty. He dismounted just beyond the broken fence, feet crunching the dry grass. He didn't wear a uniform anymore, just a long black coat and the smirk of a man who'd never been told no. Asterisk, Cullen Rourke, he called out, voice smooth as oil. Didn't think you'd still be breathing. Asterisk, Cullen stepped forward. The saber hung at his hip. His rifle was slung across his shoulder but untouched. Asterisk, I am. Asterisk, Sykes grinned. I want the women, particularly the one with the eye, and the girl, the rest ... can choose. Asterisk, behind Cullen, the women gathered, silent, weapons ready. Their faces carried no fear, only resolve. You'll have to go through me, Cullen said. Sykes tilted his head. I was hoping you'd say that. It began with fire. Asterisk, Sykes's men threw torches into the corral, sending the remaining horses scattering. Then came the crack of gunfire, quick, brutal. Maeve pulled Joe behind a trough as bullets ripped through wood. Clara moved like smoke, vanishing behind the shed, emerging only to drop a man with a single clean shot. Etta dragged a wounded woman Leanne behind. Cover, blood streaking across the dirt, Cullen moved without hesitation. The rifle kicked against his shoulder twice. Then, again, asterisk, a man fell near the water pump. Another scream near the porch. Sykes didn't flinch. He walked forward slowly, Drawing a revolver with the calm of a man pouring a drink, he fired once, hit the well, fired again, hit Cullen's shoulder. Cullen spun but didn't fall, instead. He charged. They met near the ruined windmill, Cullen with the saber drawn, Sykes with his revolver empty. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't quick, it was fists and grit and broken bone. Sykes struck first, hard, catching Cullen in the jaw. But Cullen didn't go down. He swung the saber's hilt into Sykes's ribs. Heard something crack. Dust rose around them like smoke from a battlefield. The fight felt old, like something written long ago, two ghosts locked in an ending neither could escape. Sykes reached for a hidden blade. Cullen knocked it free, then, with one last breath, drove the saber into the ground beside Sykes's throat. "I could kill you," Cullen said through gritted teeth. Sykes laughed, blood on his teeth. "Then do it." Cullen leaned in closer, voice low, final. "You're not worth the fire it would take to bury you." And he turned his back. Sykes roared, lunged. One shot cracked through the air. Maeve. She stood 20 paces away, one eye bandaged, her shotgun smoking in her hands. Sykes dropped without a sound. The fire burned slow that night, not of buildings but of pain, of memory, of all they chose to lay down. Maeve stood beside Cullen as the flames crackled low. Clara said nothing, but pressed Joe's small hands into Cullen's weathered palm. Joe didn't speak, just stared up at him. "Can we stay?" she whispered. Cullen looked at her. "At Maeve, at the ash rising to the stars, you already have." When morning came, the ranch was quiet again. Fence lines still broken, the windmill still dead. But there were voices now. Laughter, faint and tentative. The sound of someone whistling, hammering. They began to rebuild, not because the land was easy, or because the danger was gone, but because something had shifted. They had survived. And survival needed a place to become something else. Joe rode the mare in circles around the old barn. Clara taught her to shoot. Etta grew herbs near the edge of the porch. Cullen stood beneath the tree where his son used to play. He wore the locket again, not around his neck but nailed beside the shoe above the porch. He didn't speak much. But he didn't have to anymore. If you're still here, if you've ever stood alone in the fire, with no one coming to save you, then know this: sometimes the ones who arrive aren't here to be saved. They come to save you, and when they do, don't shut the gate, let them in.